I haven't done a pre-code film in a while, and I haven't done any pre-code horror films, so let's kill two birds with one stone. I've lived in Germany long enough to appreciate efficiency, and I am still an American, so of course I love killing things. Welcome to Exploitation Reviews, and me, Rouben. Today I'm taking a look at Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from 1931. Universal Pictures took a bit of a gamble in 1931 with the release of Dracula. They weren't sure if American audiences would respond to a straight horror film. There's no comedic relief in Dracula, and it doesn't have one of those it was all a dream trick endings. It's just straight horror from beginning to end, and it was a huge hit. And so Universal started producing their next horror film, Frankenstein. Not wanting to be left out of all that horror money, Paramount Pictures started to produce their own feature film, an adaptation of the Robert Louis Stevenson novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Frankenstein hit the theaters in November of 1931, and 1 month later, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde followed. Frankenstein, as we all know, created a new horror icon in Boris Karloff, but in 1932 it was Fredric March who took home the Oscar for his portrayal of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It was the first time a horror film had won an Academy Award. So let's take a look at this Oscar-winning film. It's not too often I cover respectable movies on this channel. The story here is, well, do I have to tell you the story? It's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We all know this, don't we? It's part of our culture, from Looney Tunes to Scooby-Doo to the Incredible Hulk. We know this story. But maybe I shouldn't make too many assumptions. Here's a short version. Dr. Jekyll makes a potion that turns him into Mr. Hyde. Jekyll's goal was to separate the bestial parts of the psyche from the noble, rational parts of the psyche. His hope was to somehow placate those bestial parts of human nature so that the, rational, noble parts of the nature would be free to achieve higher heights of rational experiences. That plan didn't work out. Instead, the potion allowed those bestial attributes to take over, and it created Mr. Hyde. He's a horny, animalistic brute who abuses women and kills the men who get in his way. And, no surprise, Mr. Hyde's shenanigans make life difficult for Dr. Jekyll. Will Hyde get the better of Jekyll? Will the two learn to live together again? Or will Jekyll finally placate this beast and achieve his goals? Well, whatever happens, it's important to note that none of this would have happened at all if Dr. Jekyll and his fiancée had been free to marry. They were overly restricted and oppressed by this Victorian morality and tradition, and, that's what led to Dr. Jekyll wanting to do this. He wanted to get rid of these base desires for the time being so that he could concentrate on being a scientist, before he could get married. If they had lived in a freer society and, had been able to satisfy these desires in some other way, like banging in the back of a horse and buggy, well, none of this would have ever happened. But that's enough out of me as far as plot goes. Let's talk some highlights. There's some really cool camera work in this movie. Lots of clever and fun POV shots and some really nice camera movements during the transformation scenes that hide their edits really well. And those transformation scenes, pretty damn cool. This is 1931, remember. Foam, latex, prosthetics, CGI, none of that stuff existed. So they had to resort to other techniques. Some of the effects here were done with paint that was invisible in black and white until they changed the lighting. For example, they could paint parts of the face red and then light the face with a red light, and then it would just look like a normal face in black and white film because you can't see red in black and white. And then if you change that red lighting to a green lighting, then those shadows that they had painted on really pop out. Pretty damn clever. I also really like the design of Hyde here. This simian take on the character does well to show that this bestial nature is in us all along. Humans are, after all, simians. Oh, and pay attention to how Hyde becomes more monstrous as the film progresses. That's pretty cool too. Even aside from the design of Hyde, the design of the movie in general is great. I love these big mansions. I love those Victorian, foggy streets. The burlesque house is really cool. This movie just looks great from start to finish. And, I probably wouldn't talk about this movie unless it was, kind of an exploitation film in a way, and it was. This is a pretty horny movie. For 1931, they had to be subtle.
We may control our actions, but not our impulses.
Perhaps you've forgotten you're engaged to Muriel.
Forgotten it. Can a man dying of thirst forget water? And you know what would happen to that thirst if it were denied water?
If I understand you correctly, you sound almost indecent.
But sometimes they weren't subtle at all, and they really pushed things. I mean, pushing for 1931, of course, not by today's standards. Whew, I think I'm feeling a little Twitter-pated.
Twitter-pated?
And I really have to praise the pacing of this film. A lot of old films can feel a bit slow to modern audiences. I think a lot of this actually isn't to do with the editing of the film so much as it's to do with the there's not a lot of music in old films, and in modern films the music really does sort of drive us through the scenes in ways that this is all missing from older movies, or a lot of it is missing. Here, it doesn't have, a score all the way through it, but it does have this really great camera movement all the way through, which helps push the film along. But I wouldn't say the movie is perfect. Like a hairy simian beast in a brothel, this film has some shortcomings. Actually, I don't have anything to complain about this movie. This is a stone-cold classic. Not only is it a great horror film, it's a great example of a sexed-up pre-code film. No notes. When we think of pre-code horror films, we normally think of the Universal films. Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man. These are great classic films. I love them, but we shouldn't forget about Hyde. He deserves a seat at this table. This film is every bit as good as the classic Universal monster films. And we really should be thankful that we have it at all. About a decade after this film was made, MGM started to produce their own version of the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story, and they bought the negative rights to this 1931 Paramount film. After they had the rights, they searched out every copy of the film they could and destroyed it. And for years, this film was considered to be a lost film. What the hell, MGM?